Okay, cool. So this is the third part of the game design class. Um, Again, thanks everybody for coming. It's a lot of fun doing these things. Enjoyed putting together the materials and everything and kind of revisiting old content that I haven't thought about in a while. This class, the actual lecture part, if you call it a lecture, is going to be relatively short. We're talking about the dynamic elements of game design. For those who weren't here last time, who missed it, there is a YouTube video and slides and source code and all that sort of stuff available for download. I sent an email out to hopefully everybody, but if you didn't get it, let me know and I'll send that email out. So just as a quick recap, we talked about formal elements of game design last time, and this time we're talking about dynamic elements of game design. So here is a kind of graphic that I found that I kind of enjoyed in terms of understanding the different perspectives that designers versus players take. Game designers, well, in other parlance, I think some people call it like mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics, what I call formal, dramatic, and dynamic, just different names for the same thing. But the point being that the designer kind of looks inwards out from the mechanical or the formal through the dynamic and then finally looks at the aesthetic. So that's the direction we've been moving in this class if you look at the order of the different classes. Whereas the player kind of looks from the outside in. The first thing he's going to see is the aesthetic or the dramatic, as I call it. So he's going to see your box art. He's going to see the sound, all that sort of stuff. That's going to be his first impression. And he'll kind of notice the dynamic, and then the formal or the mechanic are things that he is only aware on kind of a subconscious level. So that's what we talked about last time, is those mechanical elements. So this time, the dynamic elements of a game give you kind of the unique ability to create adjustments in real time. They respond to what's happening in the game. I've seen the thermostat analogy a lot for the dynamic elements of game design, which is that it automatically, if a thermostat, supposedly, if yours isn't all wonky like mine is, supposedly they cool it off if it gets too hot and they heat it up if it gets too warm. So that's kind of one of the functions of the dynamic elements. So what do I mean by that? Well, feedback loops. Rock Band or Guitar Hero is a good example of feedback loops, or more generally, score multipliers. It's kind of the rich get richer sort of philosophy, that as you do well, that multiplier goes up. You start earning 2x, 3x, 4x for every time you score. And that's an example of a positive feedback loop. But there's also negative feedback loops. Anybody know about this with Mario Kart? Is anybody aware that there's...
If you get good days, speed up, catch you.
Yeah, there's the game actually self-adjusts to give power-ups to the people who are losing. They will, like if you're in last place, you'll start getting better things, like better missiles and stuff like that. It's just subtle enough that you're like, God, that guy keeps getting good stuff. But just powerful enough that it keeps you at that, like, I can almost catch him. I can almost catch him. It never feels like you're too far behind that you couldn't win the race. Like everybody's played the game Mario Kart where some guy came back in the 11th hour and he kicked your butt. So it's amazing to me that they're able to do it so subtly that almost nobody realizes it's there. And yet, if it weren't there, I bet you the game wouldn't be very fun. Because you'd have the one guy who got out ahead at the beginning and he just kicked everybody's butt every time. So,
Sorry, can I ask?
Yeah.
So, I hated being reborn in GoldenEye.
Okay.
Because immediately when I'd be reborn, like, my brother he would know, and he would just, like, before I'd even, like, looked up to get my bearings, I'd be killed again.
Yeah.
And, like, so, does something like GoldenEye or Halo, where you're, like, regenerated, not do native type of feedback, or not put padding in there? Is that a purposeful thing, or is it just my brother's much better than I, so I'm just losing because...
So it's actually really interesting you bring that up. We'll talk, like, I actually have a slide in here on spawn camping.
Yeah, spawn camping.
Spawn
That's what I was looking for, thank you.
Yeah, it was one of those things that started as something that was a formal element, like, hey, you spawn at a particular spot, or a creature spawns at a particular spot. And people started exploiting it. Now, it's always been a tension in game design because there are people who really like it, or think that it's an essential part of the game, and there are people who find it incredibly frustrating. And I think it's all just kind of a matter of perspective. Like, people who like Counter-Strike, stuff like that, who've played the game for a long time, start to think of it as a part of the game, almost like a rite of passage that they went through. So it becomes a question, does the game designer even really want to balance that? Does he really even want to get rid of this notion of spawn camping? I think they definitely could. You could randomize completely where somebody spawns, but then that has its own set of difficulties. Like, if you randomize it completely, what if you spawn them right next to the objective, or spawn them in a fire, or you start opening up different problems when things like that happen. So why did GoldenEye not tweak that? I don't know. Maybe if it were a patchable game, like an online game, we would have seen them tweak that. I think ultimately it's hard to know inside the heads of the designers. Like, I think if I were designing a game like that, I would make it a map option, or have different maps which had different quantities of spawn areas to kind of let the players choose. Because like, some people will want I start here, you start there, and some people will want the more freeform.
But that is a discussion that takes place a
Mm-hmm.
lot.
Yeah.
Like, what to do with spawning, or that sort of. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I was asking. That's like, okay. I didn't know if I was. All right.
It definitely is. Like, I can't speak to GoldenEye in particular, obviously, nor do I know if it was as forefront in people's minds back then, because it was still kind of some of the early days of first-person shooters and everything. But it's like, if you think about, especially some of the better mods, like even with Counter-Strike and Day of Defeat, for example, they don't start you in a place where it's really possible to spawn camp so much. Like, they have protection zones in Day of Defeat where you can't get too close to where the person spawns. So that's like a couple generations past GoldenEye. So you can see how designers start to react to that. Which is kind of funny too, because Day of Defeat is a mod on a mod. Day of Defeat was a mod of Counter-Strike, was a mod of Half-Life. So kind of iterative reacting to what was originally maybe a problem.
Thank you.
Yeah. So rule interaction. Has anybody played this game here?
Oh, that's awesome. I have played that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm trying. Badland. That's the name of the game. I had to look at my iPhone screen to remember it. So I download and play like every single iPhone game that anybody recommends to me. I spend way too much money for like $1 just to play a game for 10 minutes. This is one of the few games that I've actually come back to and played fairly consistently. It's pretty rare for me. And what is really interesting to me about what Badland does is they introduce, there's a couple of things. There's different rules that start to come together in the game, different power-ups or whatever you want to call them that you obtain. Like, by default, your little dude is just one of those guys that's flapping around on the screen. You start with just one of them. So some power-ups will change his size and make him smaller, like he is right now. Some power-ups will multiply him. So he's been multiplied many times now. So you have, I don't know, whatever, 10 of 20 of them on the screen at the moment. And the screen is constantly moving forward. If you ever get stuck and all of your guys get pushed off the back of the screen, that's how you lose. So what's really cool about what Badland does is it's kind of a platformer puzzle at the same time. You have to figure out how to use those different rules to get around something. So in the beginning, like the first level or two I played, I could not imagine how this game was going to get tricky. I was just like, this is silly, like whatever, it's super easy. I just sped through it. By the 5th, 6th, 7th level, it starts getting to the point where like you can only, just to describe one of the puzzles in words, your guys end up getting split. So like you have to choose going up or down. The down path is essentially going to kill you, but you have to like trigger something down there that lets you get through the up path. So you have to have multiplied your guys and gotten a small, like something that makes you smaller so that you can get through a gap on the lower half and have half your guys to go through the lower half and half your guys to go through the upper half in order to get around the obstacle. So in short, I mean, to basically summarize all of that, you feel like you're kind of not almost exploiting, almost like you're kind of like cheating around the game, like you're trying to find holes. It feels just as much like you're solving a puzzle as you are beating something. I mean, we use the word beating kind of loosely these days. A lot of games, in my opinion, these days feel like just follow the tutorial until you win. And that's something really cool that Badland did, where as the complexity starts to explode, you feel like you're actually like solving through and beating something and kind of, yeah. So this is kind of what I was trying to describe here, is that when you've got 1 or 2 or 3 rules in a game, there's only so much that can happen. If you can only do a couple things with a couple of rules, and you can pretty much predict all of the scenarios. Once you add a 4th or a 5th rule, the number of possibilities starts to really explode. You start to stop being able to, as a game designer, even realize what those possibilities necessarily are. So to go back to the Badland example, it might be possible that the player at a certain point has power-ups that you weren't expecting them to have. And this could be a good thing or a bad thing. It could mean that he gets in a place of being stuck because he has some tweak on his player that makes him too big to get through a little crevasse. Or it could be a good thing for the player, which is like, he was able to beat it really easily. So the point is just that as you add more rules, the interaction between those rules starts to become more and more complex. In other words, I think I have emergence. You start to have properties in the game. The gameplay itself starts to become emergent. This is a word that's been really popular in neuroscience to describe human consciousness, which is that it seems like we can't really describe consciousness just by all of the neurons that are involved, and yet somehow consciousness emerges out of all of the complexity. It's something that is greater than the sum of its parts, essentially. You can mathematically map all of these different things that are happening, and yet none of those mathematical mappings truly capture the sense of, hey, all of a sudden we have consciousness above that. So why the picture of Street Fighter? I think one of the earliest examples of emergent gameplay was these sort of player versus player, I'm blanking on the name now, like Street Fighter versus games. Combos are essentially emergent gameplay where the designers didn't necessarily expect what was going to happen. Maybe people started learning that you right hook, stun, left hook, knee, and it's just like a deadly move and kicks the crap out of the guy. So, no game designer sat there and said, I'm going to build something that has this emergent property that if you do those moves, I mean, sometimes like these days people might design combos. You might have a special move or whatever, but emergent gameplay is about the moves that you built individually and never thought about in the sequence that the player thinks about and ends up figuring out.
So that was never programmed in the game initially?
Well, they programmed each individual move.
But they never programmed that when you do A, B, C plus D, it'll have this effect?
So I should be clear, like there are special moves, like when you see him like jump way up in the air and do something completely out of the ordinary, obviously that was programmed. Right. But if, the player might come to realize, so whenever as a player you get the sense that you found something, that's a hint that it might be an emergent property in the game. Like, if you manage to like do the entire value of somebody's health in one shot because you did like right hook, stun punch, kick, whatever, and you're like, whoa, that worked really well. I mean, I can't say for certain if the game designers ever knew that it was going to be there, but that is probably emergent gameplay. It's very unlikely that they said, I'm going to design punches and kicks. Like, think about it this way. You wouldn't design it backwards. You wouldn't start from the end and say, I'm going to design a sequence of these 6 moves that's awesome. Rather, you would start from the beginning. You'd say, I'm going to design these 6 moves. And then somebody happens to use them in that sequence. And you go, oh, whoa, that's new.
What about, like, fatalities in Mortal Kombat? Would that be, like, designed backwards?
So, yeah, a fatality, I think... Remind me exactly how that
They're
works.
Like, finish him.
Right.
And then you have to do, like...
Yeah. I just wanted to get you to say it, really. That's why.
That was awesome.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, when it says something like that on the screen, and like that is coded in. But, so, and this is why the line is so blurry, too, because... At some point, a programmer said, it's probably fun if I add this thing where if you're at 0.1% health, then there's this special case where you get a fatality move. But that might have been a formalization of something that they were already finding through emergent gameplay, if that makes sense, which is like when somebody's right at the end, it's kind of starts getting boring, and or like you just feel like you need to just finish him, and then somebody's like, well, what if we made some like special move right there? You see what I mean? Yeah. Like that's why dynamic gameplay is so ambiguous, is that a lot of times it just comes out of testing. Like my plan for this particular class is that we would actually just sit here and kind of play the game a bit and start testing out different ideas that we had, because that's really most of what it is, and starting like take what rules you have, throw in a new rule and see what that feels like, and see how it interacts with the other rules. And you know, what if you try that move before that move? Things like that. Any other questions before I skip along? So just some examples of kind of the formal dynamic mapping. So the formal in chess might be that the queen can move diagonally. The dynamic might be certain strategies, tactics, and moves that come out of that. Like 4-move checkmate is a particular set of moves that you would make based upon the formal mechanic. So the formal is what the game designer designed. The dynamic is the strategy that the player invented. And again, this is another interesting example to Areem's point about how, you know, where does that come from? Well, the game designer of chess, if there ever was one, didn't say, I'm going to invent 4-move checkmate. He said, I'm going to choose rules for the different pieces, and sometime, somewhere, someone stumbled upon this way to do a 4-move checkmate. So it's kind of the interaction between the two. We talked about spawn points and spawn camping. And it's one of those things that is exists in a lot of different games. And it's not just multiplayer either. Spawn camping is in a lot of RPGs and stuff too, when you're just camping the place where like an NPC, a non-player character spawns. You're just kind of harvesting whatever you get when you kill it. So that's kind of its own little interesting niche in the game world that if anybody's ever played games like EverQuest or World of Warcraft or MMOs like that, people will literally sit there for 6 hours on end just killing the same monster every time it spawns because they really want a lot of whatever's there. I mean, I could tell you stories about whole industries, actual industries that sprung up, especially prevalent in Korea and other parts of Asia, where people would find the sweet spot of a monster that was easy enough and repeatable enough to kill, that they could get the loot and the gold from it, then go sell that on eBay or whatever. And they'd literally turn it into a job, just sitting there camping the spawn all day, every day, playing the game. So.
Could an engineer just make up an algorithm to do that and then go, like, have their day, and then...
Funny story. That's how I got my start.
Really?
Yeah.
That is awesome. That makes so much sense.
Story time.
Story time. Okay. So I got my start in game design, not design really. I got my start in video games and even programming in general through a video game called Ultima Online, which is kind of
like the OG
The OG, yes, the original gangster of online gaming. Yeah, OG. Yeah. Right. So in Ultima Online back in the day, this is when I started playing it when I was in 7th grade. Gosh, I don't even know what year that would have been. That was probably 1999, 2000-ish. I ended up playing the game for about 6-7 years in total, and it was the OG, the pre-EverQuest, the pre-World of Warcraft, and it was a huge, huge world with hundreds of thousands of players, and it was one of the first games ever, probably the first game that I saw real examples that people were really willing to pay for currency in the game and rare items. It was getting press coverage because this was right about the time eBay was taking off, and people were selling stuff on eBay. Like you could buy 100,000 gold for $40. I remember when I was a freshman in high school, and that was like a thing to get ahead in the game. So I got my start programming really around my sophomore year. I did direct assembly code injection into the game. If anybody's nerdy enough to know what that means, basically it involves taking the game apart. And you don't have the source code, so you can't actually see what the original source code of the game was or like what the programmers saw, but you can kind of like pick it apart and look at the ones and zeros and insert some of your own stuff in. So I spent years getting really good at that and finding different cheats and exploits in the game and whatnot. And yeah, I did a number of different things. I ended up selling some of the software I wrote for about $15 a copy and paid for a lot of my movie tickets and stuff like that in high school with that. And whenever I found a big exploit in the game that was potentially money-making, rather than kind of like ruin the game by showing everybody how to do it, I'd just take advantage of it myself and actually tell the creators of the game. So I kind of had a relationship with them. Like, hey, I found this cheat where I can duplicate any item in the game. And then I'd go do that for a couple months until they fixed it, sell all the stuff on eBay, and made tens of thousands of dollars doing that.
They have a whole trust and safety team dedicated to you.
Yeah, it was pretty fun. I kind of had a standing relationship with their GMs or game masters that they didn't mess with me, I didn't mess with them, I didn't break the game too bad, they didn't ban me from it. So
were your parents just like, what the hell?
My parents knew what was going on, and they were aware of the whole thing. It was an interesting time. I mean, the reason I ended up stopped playing the game is because it got to the point where it's just I had castles on every server and way too much money. All my original friends had quit playing, and it was just this is boring. Yeah, living a full life in 7 years in the game. Right, anyway, so spawn points. So this is a screenshot of where our game stands right now, which we're gonna go take a look at again in a second. I just built our first power-up. It's this little green platform. It's a different type of planet. It's a planet that's a bouncy planet. Makes you jump really high. So I'll just kind of swing back over the code here. Oh yeah. You approve?
Yeah, totally. No bugs.
No, good. Glad to hear that. So, for those who didn't see it last time, I made a few tweaks where there's a little bit of animation now where the dude kind of squishes down a little bit and he has a little bit more of a bouncy animation going on. There is one of our platforms. Yeah, except I fell. Uh-oh, there is a bug. You should definitely be able to jump on the first platform. One of the other things I did too was that if you go off one of the sides, I suck at our game today. If you go off one of the sides, apparently I do this. It loops back around so that you end up back restarted. There you go. So it's a super bouncy platform. Oh, I can't quite make that one. Okay. So there's just one example of how you can start throwing in some dynamic elements. And what we can do today is